Chapter 21, Mind Control. Silverspot and Razorwing were in a bad situation. They were almost completely exposed to trained eyes, which meant anyone who was battle-trained with sharp senses, which was all of their enemies, could spot them. Their cover, the forest, was very thin and they're panicked. Glowing eyes weren't exactly good camouflage. Lila, Sam, and John were strolling alongside the Sentiron on the sidewalk, trying to look innocent as they kept focused gazes on their surroundings. Razorwing had a bad feeling that something unfortunate was about to happen. As he thought about this topic, his line of thinking meandered to the idea of meeting Saberclaw again. Currently, she would kill them, or at least try to if she saw them, but he and his team were trying to find her, so that wasn't what he was worrying about. Silver spots glowing, white eyes darted around the woods, scanning for any signs of movement. A rabbit lunged itself away from her foot with fear, and she jumped slightly. The two Sentiron had every right to be so on edge. They were hunting and being hunted at the same time. Every sound could mean an ambush by an enemy they can't defeat. Lila heard the thud of Silverspot's instinctive, unnecessary, and forceful dodge and scolded. "Try to be at least a little quieter," she yelled in a hushed voice. "We are surrounded by people, and we can't risk being spotted." She knew that being discovered by the human civilians wasn't the only threat, but it was her top priority at the moment. An almost silent crack of a branch was heard just yards away from Silverspot, and she immediately loaded and aimed her crossbow. Razorwing, sensing Silverspot's swift defensiveness, readied his throwing stars. Lila and the two men kept walking cluelessly until they realized they were no longer being followed. They peered into the woods and saw Silverspot and Razorwing standing in defensive positions. John sighed with annoyance. "Come on, this is ridiculous. Chill out and let's get back to base." He scrunched his nose with frustration because he felt that the robots were jumping at every single movement. Razorwing, without looking behind him at John, spoke with caution. "No, there is something different this time. That noise was too large to be any animal and too clean to be from an organic source. Something metal is trailing us, and it's big." He held out his throwing stars as he carefully surveyed the area. Silverspot silently agreed with him and violently pointed her crossbow in multiple directions. The next thing that Razorwing knew, a bright blue-green ball of light was rocketing towards his head. Out of instinct, he moved swiftly to the side, and the orb crashed into the ground behind him. Razorwing whipped around and looked upwards into the green canopy of leaves above him. The ball of light was obviously the result of a plasma blaster, but it had been coming at him from a source that was above him. Silverspot immediately swiveled on her heels to check on the humans. They were stunned, but intact. Then, she quickly glanced at Razorwing, making sure that he hadn't been blasted, which he hadn't. She looked around but couldn't see the attacker, which was unfortunate because an ambush was the type of attack that the two of them were the least able to defend against. She glanced to her left just in time to see a blue figure grab her by the neck and force her to the ground with his large body. She grabbed the rough, metal hands and began violently trying to pry them off of her. Meanwhile, she desperately tried to kick him off of her. As she fought him, she recognized him to be Lockjaw and was about to try a rolling technique when she felt his weight get dragged off of her. Silverspot fell to her knees and grasped her neck, feeling a slight dent from the force of Lockjaw's hands. She quickly sat up and looked over to find Lockjaw. She saw Razorwing holding his wing tightly, which was probably how he had pulled Lockjaw off of her. The red robot slammed his fist into Lockjaw's lower torso, and the attacker hunched over, gasping with pain. Lockjaw's wings drooped beside him as he fell to his knees. Razorwing was clearly proud of his small victory over Lockjaw, but an invisible force suddenly lifted him off of the ground and launched him into a nearby tree. Saberclaw walked quickly out of cover with her hand raised to Razorwing. She was clearly the one who had sent him sailing away from Lockjaw. She appeared angry and yelled at Lockjaw, "Serves you right, you idiot. We have direct orders not to engage." "Well, had direct orders," she barked as Razorwing struggled against her invisible hold. Silverspot stood up and spoke urgently to Saberclaw, Saber, listen to me. You are under mind control, and you have to fight it. She put her hands in front of her, but didn't unload or put down her crossbow. This showed Saberclaw that Silver Spot didn't intend to fire at her. But what if she had to? Inside Saberclaw's mind, the ghost of Rebay was controlling her tightly, but Saberclaw's conscience was indeed fighting as hard as she could. In everyone else's perspective, Saberclaw turned to Lockjaw as he recuperated and stood up slowly, holding his side. She stared at him as his wings seemed to strengthen and his posture straightened. Lockjaw also locked eyes with Saberclaw and mistook her gaze for some sort of admiration. "I'm all right. Thanks for asking." He joked, and she rolled her eyes at him. She focused a little too much on Lockjaw and stopped holding Razorwing still. The red robot launched himself to his feet and quickly lunged toward Saberclaw. He really didn't intend to hurt her, but no one else knew that. Silver Spot's face spoke for her as she watched in horror, and Razorwing crashed into the unsuspecting Saberclaw. To Rebay's credit, she had almost mastered Saberclaw's telekinesis, but wasn't used to controlling such an agile body and wasn't very good with the senses yet, so she wasn't ready for Razorwing's large body barreling into her. Lockjaw, who was standing beside Saberclaw, barely dodged Saberclaw's body as she fell to the ground. Saberclaw came back to her senses and saw Razorwing pinning her down. He unintentionally put too much pressure on Saberclaw as he held her in place, causing her to cry out in pain. Lockjaw heard Saberclaw's cry and felt his inner anger bubble to the surface. Razorwing forced Saberclaw's head to the side, and her eyes landed on Lockjaw. She noticed his purple-streaked eyes flash with a glint of furious emotion before his body reacted instantly. He moved his leg backwards so that he could get faster blast speed, and he reached between his wings, taking out his double-bladed spear. The weapon glowed in his hands with blue light as he bared his teeth. He began spinning the spear in his hands, and the glow made its fast movements look as if the weapon wasn't moving at all. Silver Spot, knowing Lockjaw's motives, quickly aimed her crossbow at him. She fired, and the arrow flew toward the back of Lockjaw's head. However, Lockjaw seemed to sense the arrow and turned around with incredible speed. Silver Spot stared in disbelief as Lockjaw stood there with the arrow in his hand. His eyes glowed with purple streaks as he glared at her, holding the arrow in his hands. He had whirled around and caught the arrow mid-flight, holding it in front of his face. He dropped the arrow and tilted his head downward with angry body language. Lockjaw slowly turned back around to face Razorwing, who was still holding Saberclaw down as she struggled, and the eerie glow of his spear reflected off of his metal armor. He threw the spear as it spun violently, almost causing him to fall over since he used all of his might. One of the spear's hooked ends caught Razorwing's arm and tore him off of Saberclaw, and he crashed into the ground nearby with a deep cut from the glowing spear. Razorwing ignored the G flowing from his arm and stood back up, watching Lockjaw closely. Lockjaw reached down and held Saberclaw's hand, helping her to her feet. She glanced at his eyes, seeing the way they softened when they landed on her. Lockjaw and Saberclaw held a longing eye contact for a few seconds before Lockjaw's right shoulder was forced behind him, causing him to stagger backward and clutch his shoulder. The two of them looked up to see what had happened, and they saw Razorwing in a position that showed he had just thrown a shuriken star. Lockjaw's shoulder was leaking blue-green liquid, but he was soon distracted from it when Silver Spot lunged at him quickly. Saberclaw was focused on Razorwing as Lockjaw and Silver's Pot fought. Lockjaw punched Silver Spot, temporarily throwing the deadly arrows of her crossbow off of their path. He ripped the crossbow out of her hands and forcefully threw it far to the side. Silver Spot grabbed Lockjaw in the chest, shoving her metal fingers under the plates of metal. The plates of metal were under so much pressure that they were almost pried off Lockjaw. The blue robot cried out from the pain because Silver Spot knew that she had pinpointed his weak spot. Silver Spot threw the shaking robot to the side, giving her just enough time to run. Instead of escaping, she ran to her crossbow and picked it up as she took large strides. Lockjaw, who had recuperated a little, was now standing up, but still didn't have the strength to chase Silver Spot. Silver Spot also knew that Lockjaw had an emotional weakness as well, and she was going to use her against Lockjaw. Meanwhile, Saberclaw and Razorwing were violently brawling. Saberclaw swung her metal fist at Razorwing's face, but he dodged smoothly as he pleaded for her to come to her senses. He pushed her away from him forcefully as he begged, "Saber, listen and fight Rebaya's control." "It's me, Razorwing, so stop attacking," he yelled as she charged at him again. Saberclaw continued fighting. "I don't care who you are, the queen demands your capture," she yelled back as she kicked upwards. Her legs straightened and she balanced on her one leg, her boots smashing into Razorwing's chin. His head flew backwards and he fell to the ground, completely at her mercy. Saberclaw raised her green dagger up above his chest as it glowed with bright green light. Razorwing knew he could not maneuver himself away, so he put his arm up for defense as he hoped that she would come to her senses and mentally fight Rebay off. A silver arm wrapped around Saberclaw's neck and pulled her down on her knees. She still held her daggers tightly, but didn't think of stabbing the robot behind her because she felt a sharp arrowhead pressed against the top of her head. She held her glowing daggers beside her, ready to attack, but didn't intend to move as Silver Spot held the loaded crossbow to Saberclaw's head. Lockjaw had to give it to Silver Spot. The silver robot was smarter than she looked, but this situation was not good. He saw the large arrow ready to penetrate Saberclaw's helmet, so he immediately dropped his spear and kicked it away. Razorwing saw Silver Spot's arrow aimed at Saberclaw, and he screamed at her, "Silver Spot, what are you doing?" His eyes were wide and practically radiating his panic. The silver shaft of the arrow gleamed in the sunlight as the rays shone through the tree leaves. It was like time had stopped since the only sound was the wind and no one was moving. Razorwing had stopped all attacks because he didn't want Saberclaw to be killed, and Lockjaw was frozen for the same reason. Lila peered into the woods with wide eyes as she watched the commotion and clung to her father in suspense. John and Sam were panting with nervousness as they watched with shock. The wind shook the trees and blew Silver Spot's wings to the side a little. Silver Spot had no intention to hurt Saberclaw, but no one else knew that for sure, so she took advantage of that. She moved her crossbow a little threateningly and yelled at Lockjaw, "Surrender, or I will pull this trigger. And don't test me, Lockjaw." She knew that Lockjaw would do whatever she said, and sure enough, Lockjaw put his hands up slowly and let Razorwing stand up and approach him. Razorwing, knowing how dangerous Lockjaw was, walked closer slowly and made no sudden moves. Lockjaw didn't move as he held his hands up, but his optics followed Razorwing's every twitch. Silver Spot held the crossbow up to Saberclaw's head as she sat on her knees with her hands up and her daggers exposed. Silver Spot leaned down and whispered into Saberclaw's audio receptors, "Saber, it's me, and you know I would never hurt you. I don't know how to help you, so you have to fight Rebaya's control on your own." She seemed so confident that her words would comfort Saberclaw's mind enough to expel Rebay from her head. Lockjaw glared at Silver Spot as Razorwing began to hold Lockjaw in a position in which he wouldn't be able to move. The blue robot stood tall and spoke with an eerie tone. "I would move that weapon away from Saberclaw if I were you. I will destroy you both if you pull that trigger." He let Razorwing bound his hands tightly behind his back as Silver Spot held Saberclaw in place. Silver Spot was waiting for Saberclaw to come to her senses, but she then realized her mistake. Silver Spot had told Saberclaw that she wouldn't hurt her, and the unsure fact that Silver Spot would shoot Saberclaw was the only thing keeping the inexperienced robot still. Lila couldn't take it anymore and screamed for Silver Spot to let Saberclaw go. Lila's panicked voice echoed off the trees, and it distracted Silver Spot for a split second. The silver robot looked up at Lila and lowered her weapon by just a few inches. This didn't seem like much of a change, but it was enough for Saberclaw to use for an escape. Saberclaw lifted her dagger suddenly, moving the broadhead arrow from her head, and it pointed towards the forest. Silver Spot, who was unfocused and slightly panicked because of the sudden movement of her crossbow, fired the arrow instinctively. At first, Silver Spot was worried that the arrow had hit Saberclaw, but it clearly didn't because Silver Spot felt metal knuckles collide with her face. Silver Spot staggered backwards, covering her face. Lockjaw, seeing that Saberclaw was free, immediately ripped his own hands away from Razorwing and whipped around. Lockjaw dodged Razorwing's futile attempt to grab him, and he held Razorwing's outstretched hand, slamming his opposite hand down on the red robot's arm, causing intense pain, but no real injury. Razorwing, slightly stunned, gripped his arm and held it as he hoped for some relief from the pain. Saberclaw turned toward the sound that had initially distracted Silver Spot. She saw Lila and the teenager's determined face that changed as they locked eyes. Lila was intimidated by Saberclaw's contaminated gaze. Saberclaw's eyes were like a glowing, blue-green liquid with hints of purple swirling through them. So Lila knew exactly how much danger she was in. Lila knew from past experiences that Rebay would capture them for hostages, and she didn't know if Saberclaw was given orders to capture them or not. Saberclaw was made of metal and was as tall as a two-story building with far superior strength compared to Lila's, so the girl was completely helpless. Razorwing and Silver Spot were both stunned and weren't thinking straight, so they didn't grasp just how much danger their human friends were in. Saberclaw originally had ignored the humans because she didn't recognize them and they weren't a threat, but Lila's call suggested that she knew Silver Spot and Razorwing personally since she said Silver Spot's name. Not to mention the girl, and the two men had seen her and Lockjaw, exposing their cover. She couldn't just let them live. Now, the green robot was identifying the three humans as characters she should be concerned about since all other humans were oblivious. Lila didn't realize Saberclaw had moved until the robot was standing in front of her, looming over her. Lila looked up at the large robot and saw the raw fury in her eyes that replaced the soft affection she was used to. Lila was terrified, but she stood tall in Saberclaw's shadow as the two glared at each other. From everyone else's point of view, Saberclaw seemed to be waiting as she observed the small, young human before her. However, from the green robot's perspective, Saberclaw's conscience was fighting as hard as possible since she knew that her best friend was in danger, and she was the only one who could help Lila. Lila was confidently standing just a few feet in front of Saberclaw, and the robot's head twitched as if something had pulled it to the side. During this twitch, the purple in Saberclaw's eyes flickered for a split second, then appeared again. Saberclaw's face twisted in frustration. Then she sighed heavily and quickly turned around, leaving Lila with her father and uncle. Lila was panting as Saberclaw walked away, and the threat of her vanished temporarily. Lila's heart beat fast as she stumbled backwards because she might as well have been looking at the face of death when she was holding eye contact with Saberclaw. John and Sam each held one of Lila's arms, steadying her as she shook nervously. Meanwhile, the ghost in Saberclaw's mind seemed to be panicked, as well as having its usual angry presence. This must have been a slight victory for Saberclaw, because Rebaya's control was commanding her to kill Lila, but Saberclaw managed to resist enough to where Rebay had simply piloted her away from the human. Rebay screeched in anger. What was that? Where are my new super soldiers, and why couldn't I make Saberclaw kill that little pest? She yelled as Boltar shrunk in fear. Boltar had witnessed Rebay clutch her head and the queen's lack of mental strength. This had never happened before. Rebaya's mind control had always been superior to the willpower of whoever she was trying to control. Boltar asked timidly, "Is it possible that Saberclaw's mechanical mind isn't compatible with your abilities?" He didn't mean to offend the alien queen, but he apparently did. Rebaya's eyes pierced through him as she dropped her voice dangerously. "What? Are you saying that I am too weak to control her?" she asked. Boltar's face dropped as he understood the real meaning of the question. If he agreed, then she would have his vitals carved out, but if he didn't, then she would assume that he did agree and was too afraid to say it out loud, still be angry at him. However, if he didn't answer, she would think he was ignoring her, so he didn't know how to respond. Rebay waved him off, but continued. "Well, tell me what plan you have forming in that massive head of yours," she yelled as she glared at him. He thought for a second, trying to quickly think of a satisfying and effective plan for the current situation. He was used to Rebay being angry because she was angry very often, but her fury wasn't usually directed at him. Rebay noticed his hesitation and decided to feed into him like she usually did to get a good and brutal plan out of him. Rebay's face softened with a slight smirk, and she walked closer to Boltar. The alien queen tilted her head as she approached Boltar. She was taller than him, so she had to lean down a little to meet his eyes. She spoke gently, but her voice dripped with poison. "Come on, Boltar, my love. Tell me a way that I can use that little prick to destroy someone, since I'm struggling to control her. Please." She smiled coldly as she noticed Boltar relax. Boltar smiled at her, sensing the way her eyes seemed to soothe his spirit. His mind calmed, and he could now think clearly without the threat of Rebay's wrath. He spoke as if he was under a spell. "Well, you could try to focus on controlling Lockjaw and being less concerned with Saberclaw. He is weaker than her after all." He slurred as he was captivated by Rebay's soft expressions and body language. Rebay smiled happily at him and sold the illusion with a gleeful bounce. "Excellent. I will follow your instructions, beloved Boltar." She ran one of her 6 fingers under his alien head, showing how pleased she was with him. Rebay turned around, facing the large window in the throne room, and clapped her hands together as she focused on Lockjaw. Suddenly, Saberclaw felt less of Rebay's presence and less of her dark thoughts. This gave her hope that she could break the alien queen's control over her. Everyone watched with confusion as the purple in Saberclaw's eyes dimmed and the purple in Lockjaw's eyes brightened. Lockjaw grasped his head and fell on his knee, kneeling. He whimpered with pain as Rebay's mind control strengthened. He could no longer control his own thoughts, and he felt his own conscience pushed to the back of his mind. He fought and tried to move his body, but his hands wouldn't respond to his commands. Panic set in as he finally realized he had been taken over. Saberclaw could now think freely, but the first thing that entered her unrestrained thoughts was Lockjaw struggling. He groaned as he clutched the sides of his head. Saberclaw's eyes went wide as she herself began to panic. She hated to see him in such pain, for she knew exactly how it felt. She ran to him and helped him stand. However, once she got a good look at him, she realized his eyes now had more bright, deep purple streaks than before. She gasped as he shook her off of him. "Lockjaw, are you all right?" She managed to control a little of her words, but the ghost of Rebay was still controlling her enough to where she didn't say anything more. Lockjaw glared at her with furious eyes. "I am fine. Now, help me capture these pests for Her Majesty." His expression was blank, but his tone made it clear that the original Lockjaw was gone. Saberclaw backed up with a sad nervousness as she watched him bare his teeth at Razorwing. He picked up his double-bladed spear tightly, and his eyes were like daggers piercing Razorwing's spirit. Razorwing's eyes went wide with fear because he knew that Lockjaw had no more morals now that Rebay was completely controlling the blue robot. Lockjaw lunged, and Razorwing had to dodge the first thrust of the spear that was headed towards his chest. Instead of hitting his vital mechanical organs, the curved blade sliced his side and began leaking G, causing Razorwing to clutch his side. He felt G running over his fingers, but that was the least of his problems. Lockjaw was already swinging his fist at Razorwing's head. The red robot felt the metal knuckles collide with his jaw. Razorwing's head snapped backwards, and his whole body stumbled to the side, collapsing to the ground. Razorwing had been hit hard enough to almost knock him out. It felt like his body weighed 10 times the amount he was used to, and he found that he couldn't get up. Any movement of his head sent pain racing through his body, and his vision blurred in the corners. He moved just enough to see Silver Spot jump on Lockjaw. Silver Spot wrapped her arms around Lockjaw's neck, hoping to stun him in some way. But his wings were large enough that it was hard to get her fingers to his neck armor. Lockjaw grabbed her arms and pulled her off of him. He held her in the air by her arms, and she struggled greatly. His face scrunched with an annoyed expression as he spoke in her face. "You nuisance. You should never have betrayed Her Highness. If you're lucky, Queen Rebay will make your execution quick." Lockjaw threw her to the side with force, and she gasped since she didn't expect his newly revealed amount of strength and power. He put his heavy, metal foot on her chest, pinning her to the ground. She grabbed his armored boot and desperately tried to pry him off of her. She soon realized that she could not escape on her own, so she looked to Razorwing. The red robot was on the ground, struggling to get up and seemed incapable of doing so. This led Silver Spot to give up on seeking help from him, so she quickly turned her head to Saberclaw. The green robot was in shock and just watched Lockjaw press his bladed weapon against Silver Spot's neck. Silver Spot screamed for Saberclaw. "Saber, help!" she cried, since she knew that she may not ever stand up again. Saberclaw simply raised her hands a little as she tried to sort her own thoughts. Everything seemed to slow down as Saberclaw watched, Rebea's control tightening and keeping her from moving as Silver Spot cried out to her.